Okay, thank you. So good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Special Electoral Area Services Committee meeting of March 2nd, 2022. As always, I'd like to acknowledge we're meeting today on the ancestral territories of the Coast Salish peoples. So today is another in our series of meetings on the modernized official community plan. And we have to break at noon. We have a second meeting at 1:30, so we do have a second meeting if we need it next Thursday. So we'll just see how progress goes today. And with that, I'll turn to the first item on our agenda. Please, Ms. Harrison. Motion to approve moved, seconded. All in favor? Opposed? Motion carries. Next item, please, Ms. Harrison. Okay, thank you. Okay, thank you, and welcome to Patrick and Mark again. And Patrick, I assume you're leading. I don't know if we want to make you work quite as hard as you did last time, but...
Corley, did you have anything to start us off?
Yes, through the chair, for the purposes, I understand that the meeting is live now for the purpose of anyone viewing. We have two presenters today, Patrick Ostrich from MODIS and Mark Holland from Holland Plan, that will be presenting the first four policy goal areas in draft bylaw 4373, which is the OCP for the electoral areas, the modernized OCP, and the draft performance metrics. We also have available for questions or clarifications, Aaron Licker from Licker Associates, who's the GIS specialist who's been working with our GS team and MODIS on the growth containment boundaries and the new land use designations. So over to you, Patrick. Thank you.
Thank you, Corley. And thank you to all the directors. It's a great opportunity again to see all of you in one room here and to go over some of the finer details of the modernized official community plan for the electoral areas. We've made quite a few changes since the last time we've presented this document, I think in October of 2021. And so there has been quite a few updates to policies, to metrics, to ensure that it reflects the vision and the direction of residents, yourselves, and the broader community. And so I'm going to start off by sharing my screen here, and we'll go over some of the main points, I think, for each of the policy chapters, as well as the performance metrics that we're proposing to link those policies in order to be able to really measure whether we're making progress on some of these major policy fronts. So can everybody see my screen here? Is that great? So today I'll start off with a quick few slides just on the purpose of today's meeting, then we'll move into the policies and the metrics. So as Corley stated just earlier on, we'll try and get through 4 policy chapters today. If we have time and we can continue moving forward, then we might be able to get through a few others. If we can do all 8, that would be even better. But essentially, we expect to be able to get through 4 today, and then if we need to, we can see another 4 policy chapters on March 10th. Then I'll just have a few slides on the next steps. All right, so really today is an opportunity to go over the policy chapters, the policies themselves, and performance metrics within the modernized official community plan with you, the directors of the electoral areas, and then receive feedback on that and in preparation for the community circles that are planned to be held and facilitated quite soon. And so I'd like to also I guess, impress upon the directors that much of the policies, I believe we are at a state where the policies are in a fairly good balance in terms of the level of detail in certain areas that we really want to focus on, and in terms of general direction in areas in some of those higher level points and some of those areas where we would like other documents to do the heavy lifting. So oftentimes official community plans can kind of become a little bit of a resting place, a big laundry list of policies. And we want to make sure that these policies are quite strongly related to really the meat and potatoes of an OCP, to land use, to growth, and to development. Otherwise, there are other documents, other plans, other strategies that can hold policy as well. And so, we'll be looking at, as we move forward, whether some of these policies, whether some of these ideas that are going to continue filtering in from the community and residents and other groups and stakeholders, whether they fit in the OCP or whether they should also perhaps be explored as part of the local area planning process, whether they should be things that we consider integrating into a modernized zoning bylaw or other master plans and strategies like infrastructure servicing strategies or parks master plans, other kind of documents of that nature. So we don't want to create an OCP that really holds all the weight of the region on his shoulders. We want to be able to distribute some of these policies, some of these ideas into other documents where they will fit a little bit better. So today we think we've reached that balance, and we'll be really looking forward to hearing some of the comments in terms of just hearing what directors have to say, and ensuring that we can now adapt and maybe refine the MOCP as we look towards the community circles. So with that said, let's get into it. We know there's 8 big goals as part of the MOCP, and each one includes a set of policies. So there's mitigate and adapt to the climate crisis. Since the last time you saw this document, we've pulled this policy chapter and brought it to the front. It was just to emphasize the importance of this particular policy goal. There's manage infrastructure responsibly, make distinct, complete communities, expand mobility options, protect and restore natural assets, strengthen local food and agricultural systems, enhance regional prosperity, and improve governance and implementation. Now, this last policy chapter is really about implementation, so there's no performance metrics necessarily related to it specifically. The policy metrics are really intended to form a part of that improved governance and implementation chapter. We also just want to highlight that there's a social equity lens that was applied to the document, essentially just ensuring that we're taking into account the impacts of these policies. And so we'll note that some of the policies have a little indicator next to them. If it's a little circle, that means these are priority equity policies. This means that these policies would have an impact on improving equity across the region. And then there's other policies that require implementation considerations to make sure that they don't negatively impact certain groups, certain populations who have a history or have a tendency to face greater barriers to access of services or could be impacted by these policies negatively. So it's just a way to frame policies and to add another layer of considerations as we look towards implementation of the MOCP. I'll pass it on to Mark for a couple slides here, just introducing the performance metrics and some of the thinking around it. Mark? Oh, we can't hear you, Mark. Sorry, I think we're just having a few technical difficulties here. But maybe what I can do, I can give a bit of the overview here, and as Mark tries to fix his microphone, and we'll hopefully have him be able to present some of the performance metrics later on in the presentation. So in terms of the performance metrics, I mean, it's quite simple in terms of the goal of these performance metrics. It's to really evaluate the effectiveness of the policies, make sure we're making progress on the big objectives and the goals of the MOCP. So the scope is really a set of metrics connected to each of the major policy goals in the MOCP. So you'll see that there's metrics associated with each one, some a bit more than others, mainly because of the ease in which it is to find data on those particular policies, and in other cases it is a matter of the consistency of the type of data, the ability and ease in which it's able to access that data and to calculate perhaps the GIS and metrics associated with those with that data. So some of the criteria, we really want them directly related to those policy goals. We want accurate data for the CVRD and the electoral areas that can be regularly updated. And we also want to minimize the cost and the time for CVRD staff to access and process that data. So starting us off here with the first policy chapter in the MOCP to mitigate and adapt to the climate crisis. Here, the major challenges that we are facing are impacts to water quality and quantity, threats to ecosystem biodiversity, the risks to both silviculture and agricultural activity, and of course, extreme heat, flooding, and wildfires. So these are some of the major impacts that we can expect from the climate crisis. And so these are the challenges that we're also trying to address as part of these this set of policies. So the objectives here are really about reducing transportation, building, and solid waste GHG emissions as part of the mitigation strategy, but then to also strengthen the region's climate resilience and adaptation measures to be able to respond to any kind of perhaps weather-related events or other hazardous conditions as a result of climate change. And so really the two big topics in this policy chapter are related to mitigation and also adaptation or resilience. So I've shown here a few sample policies. I think each policy chapter has approximately 30 to 40 policies, so I'm not going to be able to go over every single one of the policies, of course, but I've applied a few sample policies here. And some of the ones that I've chosen are the ones that are directly related to performance metrics. So you'll notice if there's a star, an orange star next to that particular policy, that means there's a metric that is associated with that and something that we can measure in terms of ensuring that we're making progress on that front. And so in terms of climate change mitigation, there's a few policies related to specifically reducing our GHGs, and in this case, retrofitting older buildings and using green construction methods to achieve greater efficiency and a reduction in GHG emissions from our buildings. We also want to incentivize a shift away from things like wood stoves and oil and gas furnaces, again, to reduce emissions and impacts on public health. And another example of a mitigation policy here is also minimizing our waste generation and encouraging the greater diversion of all waste materials with the goal of achieving zero waste as one of your primary waste management goals from the solid waste strategy. In terms of adaptation...
Sorry to interrupt. I just noticed Mark Holland asking for the phone number to phone in. So perhaps Ms. Harrison, could you? Not sure if you're on the chat.
Can you hear me now?
Okay.
Can anybody hear me at the moment?
Yes.
You can hear me now. Okay. Then maybe we can use this. I've had to log in about 7 times to get it to work. So we can, but if you give me the phone number, then I can have that ready as well if this gives out at some point. I apologize for this.
No worries. Your audio is a little better.
So in terms of adaptation measures that we're proposing as policies, a few sample policies here. So obviously preparing a hazard, risk, and vulnerability assessment and really communicating the findings to CVRD communities through a strategy of outreach and education as a really important part of making sure that we're ready for any kind of future hazards or risks. Also conducting an analysis of drought-related indicators to more fully understand the climate impacts related to drought and things like our water supply and ecosystem health. And finally, strengthening emergency management capacity to really respond to weather-related emergencies. There is a set of policies in the MOCP that deals with a bit more direct detail on this particular matter, like setting community hubs and having a better organization around any kind of emergency planning and management. So this is a set of policies here, just sample policies, but of course there's many more in the actual document. I'll pass it on to Mark to speak a little bit to some of these metrics that are associated to these policies.
Thanks, Patrick. And again, I apologize for the technological challenges. A few thoughts that I wanted to mention at the beginning. Obviously, we have been wading through literally many hundreds of indicators over the last 2 years, working with Corley and the team to get some metrics that you can track to cover performance and changes over time to inform policy and to inform you on the success of your measures that you're taking to achieve these policies. Some of the key factors that are affecting our information here is the availability of data. There is quite a bit of data available, but not in a continuity, with no continuity, as in it's from one study that may never be repeated. This was our biggest challenge, I think, in finding data that you can continually get that is accurate, continuous, that is responsive to your jurisdiction for making change, and also fits within your resource constraints of not having to do many studies every few years in order to update it. And finally, in order to keep the data within your geographical boundaries. Now, obviously, not all the metrics in this program fit those requirements, but to the greatest extent possible, we've been keeping them within those constraints. So on the climate agenda, you track the metrics that we're proposing you use. And again, these can be evolved based on your advice and the advice that comes in from the community. The corporate GHGs from your from your regional fleets and buildings and lands that you own, you already report on those, so that is reliable and continuous and is within your jurisdiction, and you will be able to report on that with very little extra effort for every reporting cycle in the OCP. Energy consumption in buildings is one of the few factors that the province continues to report on. You will all remember that a number of years ago, about 10 years ago, the province was producing climate change emissions, climate emission reports for every municipality, because they're the ones that can access the data most effectively through BC Hydro, gas, and other areas that actually are covered by privacy concerns in some cases. They ceased to do that a while back, and they're only reporting on a few things and their associated emissions. So that's one that we can rely on. That becomes essentially a proxy for climate emissions from buildings. And I think, as you all know, buildings and transportation are our two biggest sources of emissions. The next one is community emissions associated with solid waste. This is another factor that the province tracks, so we can get that data for you on a regular basis. This obviously is associated with your process of moving waste out of the region for the landfill. So there's a fairly high associated emissions compared to many other areas and costs related to that. And that's part of some of the policy discussions. The drought level is a key. We looked at a number of larger climate change factors, including sea level rise, obviously CO2 equivalents in the atmosphere, and others. Those are interesting. They're available at any time to anyone. They don't necessarily need to be part of the OCP process. They're also so macro that your efforts will not show particularly any particular change. This is the third of those fairly large ones, but it seemed to have a very direct connection to policy at your level, which is essentially the drought level. Now, the province tracks this across the region, but it'll include several of the regional districts on either side of you on the east side of the island. So we propose to keep this in just to have more definition around essentially how many days or weeks of the year that extreme drought levels are being experienced in the region, so we can begin to track that, because that affects many different factors of your policy. And finally, the shift in climate agendas to include a lot more resilience and adaptation is growing across the world, not just in mitigation and reducing emissions. And this is where the fifth metric has been proposed, which is the basically response coverage across your rural areas for fire and emergency capacity. So this is one here that you track on a regular basis. We can get updated data on a regular basis for each of the electoral areas. So those are the metrics that we're proposing to track to support the change in performance, to map that and give you feedback as decision makers going forward on this chapter of the OCP. Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions? Maybe if we take the screen down, we'll just have a look at the director. Okay, I see Allison. Go ahead.
Thank you. I guess on the metrics, I think it would be helpful to provide a little bit better, more description for energy consumption in buildings, and some clarification on the solid waste greenhouse gas emissions, because I don't think most people would understand whether how much kilowatts would be appropriate. You know, it sort of needs to be in context, and these are sort of gross numbers that we haven't. Obviously, there's not much change that we see from 2007 to 2016, and metrics really are about showing whether you're making progress to achieve your goals. So it's like I'm not. For me, it doesn't seem particularly helpful, except to tell me that we're not doing anything. And the solid waste issue is a little bit more complicated, because I'm not sure if this means the solid waste before it gets shipped to Rabanco or before, or, yeah, that's what I don't understand. And then my other comment is, I have a problem with drought level being used as an indicator. It is important to track drought, but it's not something we can influence at all. And also, our river levels and the health of our watersheds and the water availability during drought periods isn't tied right to the drought. It's a combination of heat and past water infiltration and all that kind of thing. So it's a much more complicated thing than just talking about drought. And actually, when you look at your graph, like in 2019, the Coxsackie River we had a ministerial order to shut down farmers from irrigating. But when you look at the graph, it looks like 2019 was a pretty darn good year. So to me, it doesn't seem particularly relevant or anything that we can use as an indicator for progress. So I think we need to think a little bit more about that area. And
so Allison, I'll let Mark have a crack at those, and then we'll come back.
Okay.
Thanks, Director Nicholson. Through the chair, completely agree with you on all of those points, and it's been part of the challenge that we've had in trying to work through what the right indicators are, and the rather large number of them that are lying on the cutting floor that didn't match up. We can certainly add some additional explanation if you feel that the indicators, the metrics here, warrant some additional explanation to, such as, you know, what an average building use is for energy. We can certainly do that. I completely agree with you on the slow movement on the buildings. The issue around the buildings, obviously, is buildings, once they're built, don't get renovated or changed very often, and so we see a slow arc in the energy use. It's the only one that we can access reliably, that we were able to find, that the province will validate to give you a sense of what the energy emissions are. And I think it does speak to the scale of the challenge of beginning to reduce our emissions fairly quickly in terms of the need for building retrofits, particularly as growth continues. But we can certainly add some additional information to both the solid waste and the building ones to give folks who look at the metrics a sense of what's actually included in those numbers, and also some observations about how much it changes. Regarding drought level, completely agree again on the complexity. The drought level was one that we proposed based on its sort of very visceral experience by people in the region. Climate, how climate change really affects them. Sea level only affects a few, and it's a very slow moving dynamic. Big floods are another large one, which come under infrastructure and how we respond to those. But the drought level was one of those. At your direction, if it's the board's willingness, we'd be pleased to take any of these out or add further direction to them if you wish.
Thank you. So maybe Allison, can I go to Lynn first and then come back?
By all means.
Okay, Lynn, and then Ian.
I'm sure that we all have a lot of questions. One of the things that I found was the graphs are, we're 9 electoral areas. And when we look at the graphs, to me, it just doesn't mean anything to my community to read this. Because the GHG emissions, corporate, what does that mean? Are you talking, it would be more information if the people could see a building in their particular area and how it related to that building. It would bring it closer to home for them. Looking at big number, at a graph it doesn't mean anything. It hardly meant anything to me. And I find, a lot of the graphs are they don't bring it home to the people. And I think that, graphs are always great. People enjoy them because they're visual, but they need to have a little more, something that relates to them in their own neighborhood in some of these graphs. And I looked at the fire emergency graph, and there's no indication. I mean, F, G, and I, we all have huge managed forest sections. So it looks like, we don't have a lot of fire protection. Well, our communities that are residential have the fire protection. We don't have the forest fire protection in the same equal, and I'm sure Ian or Klaus could speak to that. Actually have it for the residential. Well, I think those are some of the things. I'll just stop there. They were on my list. Thank you.
Thank you. Where was it? Were you looking for a response, Lynn, or is that just a comment?
I was just looking for putting a comment in regarding the graphs, and that they don't relate to anything that a person in a community would actually go, oh, wow, look at that building in my community is having huge emission issues. We need to figure this one out, Okay.
Right. Thank you.
And the note about the fire, because it makes it, there's a reason for ours. Thank you.
Right.
If I may offer one comment through the chair, the issue around the fire protection, what we can do, Lynn, is to look at the see if we can get the data on the residential areas. The data here, we've drawn it extensively on the GIS department for many of these at different times. In this case, what we might be able to do is to take essentially the protection and bring it back down to some other variation of this metric that speaks more to the areas that are primarily residential or have a lot of residences living and working in them, in order to offset these. You're absolutely right that some of your electoral areas have very large areas of of forestry, which can skew the data the way it looks like that. We'll take a look at that and see if we can find a variation of that metric that would be a little more responsive to the settled areas. Thank you for your direction.
Okay, follow up, Lynn?
Just a quick follow-up. You know, what you could put in there is that this is residential, because in Area G, we're 97% managed forest. And then you could also put the indicator that, you know, 97% has no fire protection because it is the managed forest. So it gives people an idea a little bit more. Thank you.
Thank you. So Ian? Thank you. See Mark noting.
We can go back in and take a look at what that is. I think these graphs were intended for, the data is only really available, I believe, at these fairly large levels. We can go back in and see if we can break this down. I think this conversation is a fantastic one to show the complexity of what's happened over the last 2 years in trying to find metrics that are responsive and relevant in some form within your boundaries with data that we can get reliably year after year on this. It's quite a surprising challenge to do that. But we'll go back in. I'm taken very clearly from several of your directions here that the metrics, we need to revisit both the explanations of the metrics and some of the metrics themselves to make them more responsive and relevant to the residents of the region in terms of what this means to them or how it might stimulate their support for action on certain areas.
Okay, thank you. I'll turn to Klaus now, please.
At our last meeting, I brought some of my concerns up, and I noticed some of the issues have been dealt with that I brought up, but I am still really concerned about this whole idea of equity. As far as I'm concerned, that shouldn't be in an official community plan, because what this section is trying to do, it's trying to actually rearrange the social framework of our whole society if we were to adhere to it. And I don't think local government has any business in that. That's provincial or federal government. It's for us to kind of make applicants aware that we are, well, I mean, if you even consider equity priority group, it's an oxymoron to start with. If we want to have an equitable society, then there is no priority group. There cannot be. The moment you have a priority group, you take away from the others. So this whole concept, it goes really against my grain. I just don't like it. And so it's not only the equity framework, but the social equity checklist in the back there on page 117, I think. It's aimed at applicants. It's aimed at people that move here. So are they supposed to now think about, okay, how am the building that I'm going to erect, is it going to be affecting other social groups at a disadvantage, or what is this trying to achieve? And I mean, think about if and then you talk about enforcement. How would you even enforce something like this? Are we going to have social equity police now? I mean, this whole concept, I think it just doesn't have, it shouldn't be in an official community plan. That's, if we wanted to point something like that out, we might have a pamphlet to hand out to newcomers and say, okay, we're trying to do this, be considerate of that or whatever. I can see that. But in an official community plan to point out, we're trying to go into this direction because they're disadvantaged groups and we're going to make those a priority now. First of all, how are you going to follow that? Anybody that looks at this with, what am I supposed to do now? And then if it is not followed, how are we going to enforce it? There's no enforcement mechanism. The CBID can't go out and say, hey, you know, the building you put up there, that's really, let's say it's a, I don't know, a disadvantage to this group or to this group or to this group. We don't like it. So what are we going to do? What is the essence of that? So there's a lot of nice talk in there and pointing out, yes, there's been, let's say, disadvantages to some individuals or groups. And I admit, yes, there have been. But I don't think it's up to local government to try to change society. Anyway, that's my comment.
Okay, thank you, Klaus. So I have Mike and then Sierra before we go to round two, back to Allison. Patrick, did you have your hand up?
I through Director Salmon to Director Kuhn, I just wanted to provide a couple examples of why equity is perhaps a lens that's being used in more and more official community plans and strategies. I think it's come to the forefront that zoning and land use in general has been used to exclude certain groups in the past. So there have been the use of zoning as an example has been used to exclude certain types of classes, certain types of groups from land. And so zoning at its basis has been used to really to impact society, to segregate, and to kind of create different neighborhoods where certain people are excluded. Another good example is, say we're in there's a big emergency, a big climate emergency, a hazard that occurs, and if sort of the information that's provided to folks is only in English, that means a lot of people who don't understand, can't read English, have less of an opportunity to escape that hazard or to find a community hub, to find the supports that they might need, and so on. So really what this equity lens attempts to do is to just apply a little bit more of an understanding around those types of issues to make sure that when we are implementing certain policies, that we're considering perhaps translating materials, that we're considering perhaps the impacts that it would have on certain disadvantaged groups. And perhaps there's ways, it's like when we provide incentives for electric vehicles as an example, is another example, that means that certain people who can't afford vehicles are left behind in the ability to actually impact GHG emissions. We're essentially giving money towards people who can afford electric vehicles. So there's all sorts of examples like this when I think it is important to sometimes just consider what are the impacts on some of these groups? How can we ensure that, we're not creating a more segregated type of community?
Okay, thank you. So we'll go to Mike and
yeah, thank you, Blaise. Thank you, Patrick. These Klaus brought up the right things, exactly the same thing as I brought up right at the very beginning. Some of the wording, the phrasing in here is just far too broad. It's open to any kind of interpretation. And much, there's one particular one that says, without explicit consideration for the needs of the equity priority groups, disparities will continue. Of course they will. There will always be disparities, but is it up to us to actually try and change that? We can do what we can. We don't need it in a document here. And one of the things here is we had a thing in England going way back where the same thing was actually tried to be brought in, and it led to a thing called reverse discrimination, where you were trying to include everybody and in the end excluded a lot of other people as well. So this language is just a little bit too broad for my liking. It needs to be more specific. And one of the other things that that worries me, there are two references to benefiting the wealthy. What does that mean? Who's wealthy? I might be wealthy compared with somebody else, but this is just too general. We need to take that kind of language out. We shouldn't be quoting the wealthy, the poor. We are all in this together. Let's get that straight. We benefit everybody. And some people, yeah, I've got more money than others. I've probably got a little bit more money than others. But that doesn't mean to say that I'm wealthy or anybody else. I don't have an electric car. I can't afford one, right? But get rid of this kind of, it's almost discriminatory to the extent that it's excluding people as opposed to trying to include them. And that's it for the time being. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mike. So now we'll go to Sierra and then Lori, please. A close-up with you on the bottom after. Thank you.
Thank you, Blaze. I love how you're doing first names. Like at École Cobble Hill, the teachers and the kids call each other by the first name. I love that. Anyway, I don't know if this is the place, time, whatever, but talking about equity, and it brings up for me the how can we address, I guess, like through zoning and so what we have happening in Shawnigan Lake and other areas, lakefront, oceanfront, there's a real exclusivity that's happening, and like we see on Shawnigan Lake, probably 80% are cottages or second homes. So and so the access to the lake is becoming more and more exclusive, and it's something that the community wants more than anything, is more access to the lake. So I'm just wondering if there's ways to mention it and to encourage. Well, I know that we have some certain zoning that might help support it, or we change it a little bit. Recreational pays lower taxes, that kind of thing. But it's also it helps increase further the issues with local businesses getting employees, and for those employees having homes. So just wondering if you've gotten into that much detail.
Patrick.
Yeah, through Director Salmon to Director Acton. Yes, absolutely. So land use, this is a perfect example of land use kind of creating a bit of an exclusionary type of urban pattern, right? Where there are perhaps, where access to the lake becomes, something that is really only accessible to those who can afford a cottage, or to those who, have that waterfront property. And so really the way that we can address those types of issues is through land use. It's by perhaps having land uses like multifamily housing land uses, and parks and green open spaces, land uses adjacent to the park, so that if you can't afford a waterfront property, you at least have a public space next to the lake. Or we can encourage certain types of units, certain types of housing next to the lake. I mean, even when it's a multifamily unit, I mean, the cost of land is a big component there. So it could still end up being, you know, say, a luxury apartments next to the lake, right? So there is also considerations around affordable housing policies, and you know, there are policies in the MOCP that speak directly to trying and address the housing needs of the community in those multifamily land uses. So I would say that, you know, in the case of Shawnigan Lake, I think Shawnigan Village, we've incorporated the results of the charrette, of the Shawnigan Lake charrette, the Shawnigan Village charrette, I should say. And it does include, I believe, greater access to the lake, greater open spaces and green spaces next to the lake. And I would hope that that would improve access. But it certainly is something that I think, you know, maybe the local area plans in the future can dive into a little bit more detail on the specific sort of block by block type of land uses and zoning that would be appropriate to provide greater access to, you know, folks who might not be able to afford a waterfront property.
Thank you. Okay, now I'll turn to Lori, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to say that, speaking to the inequity piece, that diverse communities are actually a better place to, I think it needs to be in for land use for us, and it needs to be in there somehow. How the wording goes, I'm not sure, but that's a perfect example of the parks and trails and the access that other different types of community members were able to afford and other ones weren't. And also language barriers, age, you know, the disabilities, all of that needs to be in there and has been left out since we've been designing our community. So that definitely the inequity piece needs to be there. How it's put or whatever, I'm not sure, but diversity is a much better community that I want to live in. Thank you.
Great, thank you. So we're due for a break in about 7 minutes or so, but I'll go to round two now, which is Allison, Klaus, and Ian. Allison, please. Oh, and Lynn, okay.
Well, the conversation has certainly taken quite a turn over. I thought we were talking about the climate change thing specifically, but I will weigh in on the equity front. I find, I think that we sit here as very privileged people, and everyone has blind spots. And I think it's very important to have a framework about equity that provides us with a more disciplined way at looking at the unintended consequences of decisions. And the thing that I would probably add is that I am concerned that we haven't got a similar kind of checklist for the climate change front, because I think a lot of our decisions have very negative impacts on greenhouse gas emissions, for example, and we think, oh, it's just a small thing, but they all add up. They all the cumulative effects are huge, and I think we need to be smarter about this and more sort of systematic in how we decide what we do. And you know, like for example, we have these huge lists of potential policies that we might be interested in pursuing. Just weighing one policy against the other, if you have limited resources in putting things in place, you need to kind of have a way of structuring your decision making about that. So I am very for these decision making frameworks that help guide decision making, or at least guide how we think about things.
Great, thank you. So go to Klaus, then Ian, then Lynn. Klaus.
Yes, I would agree with that we have to point out in the OCP that yes, not everybody has lakeshore property, not everybody has, let's say, an expensive home. There should be consideration for the general population. What I just don't like is equity priority groups. I just don't like that whole concept. The moment you put something into a priority, you're creating inequities. It's unavoidable. So that's, and to get back to what Director Wilson said earlier, he has some of the same concerns, only he goes in a different direction. He says, well, we need to kind of nail it down in more detail. And I would say to that, be careful what you wish for. Because if you nail it down in more detail, you're going to really box yourself into a corner. Then what are you going to do? Now it's a board decision. Now, well, remember, you decided that. Bang, and we're up against, and we run into that so often, as you and I have often discussed. And so I would stay away from it. I want to have as little as possible equity mentioned, or equity priority, or different races or groups or whatever. The moment you mention these, the moment you're creating inequity. You're trying to have preference for one group or another. So now we have two different. Let's say, just an example. So now you're trying to prioritize an equity group. Well, which equity group has higher priority over the other one, and who's making the decision? I mean, you're getting into a black hole where there is no exit. You're going to get sucked in, and we're going to open ourselves up by the public for criticism. For you haven't done, and it's in your OCP. You said you were going to do this, so now we're going to be on the defensive. We're going to have to defend our actions. I hate to be in the defensive because it happens too often to the CVID board that we have to defend ourselves. We shouldn't be in that position. The only reason we get into that position is because we make decisions earlier that fence us in so tightly that it's so easy for the public to come. Yeah, but remember, you said that, and for that reason, I would leave all that equity out. I would reword it. I would say, yes, there should be a preference on official properties like parks and recreation and all that, and that is given anyway. But we cannot, as far as I'm concerned, and I'm going to be really strong about it, we cannot make a difference between, let's say, high-income people and low-income people, or certain races or certain religious associations. If we're supposed to be one country that acts together, we cannot segregate them, and that's what we're trying to do here.
Okay, thank you, Klaus. I think you've made your point quite clear. So I saw Patrick had his hand up.
Yeah, I would just suggest that I think we can certainly revise the language there and see if we can come up with something that is perhaps a little bit more amenable to the group of directors.
Okay, thank you. I'll turn to Ian, please. Thank you, Ian. Okay, one more before the break, and that is Lynn.
I think you might have thought you should have gone for break when I got started. I have a very long list. So we've obviously moved to the social equity considerations and away from where we started. So I'm just gonna
Sorry,
continue.
Lynn, actually, could I interrupt? If you do have a long list, maybe we should go to the 10-minute break now and come back. That's okay with that? Okay, let's come back at 10:10, please. Thank you. Thank you. Welcome back, everyone. So we will go back to Lynn with her question.
Thank you. I'm not sure that it's a question. I just wanted to, we had moved on to the social equity considerations, and the document, when I read it, I just feel that we're headed down a rabbit hole. As soon as you indicate someone is a person that is Black or a person of color, it is not for us to decide. I mean, I have Kentucky background. I also have some interesting color in my background. So I think that we need to be really cautious when we're going down these rabbit holes. I think we need to pull out any reference to any group, color or Indigenous or areas that is not our area of jurisdiction. And I also think that coming into, we have many nationalities within Canada. We're a melting pot. And growing up, I grew up with multicultural nationalities, and we all treated each other equally. And I think that's what we're here to do, is treat equally. But we must not make reference to this person has more money than this person is a color, this person is Indigenous, this person is a single parent. We need to just be equal in all our language. And I find when you get down to here, where you're looking at the heritage and cultural history, I really take offense to, since colonization, settlers have forcibly erased Indigenous heritage from the built environment. I don't feel that that's my background in my family, and I take offense to having that and having to read that in front of me. I think that we can't paint everyone with one solid brush, and that should not be included in any of our documents. And then I look down here and it says, during creation and implementation of heritage policies, the regional district should partner with and adequately compensate local Indigenous and other equity. I wonder, what does adequately compensate mean? And then I move into another page on natural assets, and I wonder what should be central. What does that mean? And then we look at where it says CVRD can partner with and fairly compensate local Indigenous groups. What does fairly compensate mean? Why are we don't have definitions? Then we move into our food and agriculture. And you wonder, how will we make decisions in that? And what about septic systems, sewer systems, accessory buildings? We delete and delete and delete our agriculture. And then we get down to regional prosperity, and we say here, economic innovations for all too often initiatives for economic innovation benefit the wealthy? Well, those wealthy are actually creating the jobs for others within our community. So you say that someone is wealthy and no, that's not what they should be. And yet they support our communities and they also support our jobs. Moving into the climate action, there's other areas down here. Are some of these not federal and provincial government areas that we should be not getting into, that they should be adequately compensate? And, you know, just hazard areas are not necessarily lower income neighborhoods. They can be any place. So I think there's so many things that are just not our jurisdiction, and we're heading down a rabbit hole. I don't want to look at what the past be down the road and someone point back to us and say that government did. We've seen that in the past. We know the mistakes that the federal government has made and provincial governments have made. Let's not step into those footprints, because to me, I would be very, very heartbroken to see myself later pointed back at for things that we make a mistake on now. So I think we need to stick to our knitting and not go down rabbit holes. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you, everyone. And these were a lot of general comments. So Patrick?
Yeah, through the chair to Director Smith, I think some of that language is coming, if I'm correct, from the equity backgrounder. Is that like when you speak to things about compensation, and is that from the backgrounder? Because I don't believe that's in the MOCP document itself, right? Is that correct?
It was part of our documents that we received.
Okay.
If I may, Chair, it's Schedule A, Official Community Plan. It's the companion to bylaw.
Okay. So it's the companion document and the equity backgrounder that you're referring to. Okay. I just wanted to verify and confirm that. Thanks.
Thank you. Go ahead, Ben.
Thank you. And, you know, I think this is great conversation. I listen with interest because, you know, disparity or diversity, equity are all things that exist or in our community. And I think where we are today has been based on decisions of the past. Where we go to the future, I think has to be really made with decisions that take these things into consideration. And where this document fits, whether it's an OCP or not, I leave that to the consultants. But I would suggest that the idea that OCPs can create that come out of OCPs can create it is something to the community, so they have an understanding of that. How far this goes down, you know, beyond that, I don't know. But I think you mentioned that before, Patrick, about you know, previous land use decisions have caused issues with inequities or with equity, and so I guess having that kind of statement in there would be something that I would see a benefit to my community, anyways.
Okay, thank you. So everyone can hear me okay? Okay, great. So Patrick, is it time to carry on then with, I don't know what section we're at, but that would be great.
I think he's muted.
Sorry, I was just saying this is a great discussion, an important discussion, in fact, and I'm glad that at least we can have this dialogue, and we'll do our best to reflect the comments and the feedback in the next version as broadly as possible. I think another important piece of information that we just want to ensure that the directors are aware of is the Local Government Act does provide direction in terms of requiring certain policies related to affordable housing, related to rental housing, and also special needs housing. So that's something that needs to be addressed within an official community plan. It also speaks to the ability for official community plans to address certain things related to social well-being and social planning. So there is leniency in the act for that type of material, but I'm hearing from some directors that there is maybe a little bit too much of it or too bright of a focus on it. So we'll certainly take that into consideration in the next round here. Thank you. So moving forward into the next policy chapter, it's manage infrastructure responsibly. And so here the challenges that we're facing in the region relate to the life cycle considerations of the existing infrastructure that exists in the region. There's limits to capacity in many places in terms of water and sewage units. Oversight and maintenance of that infrastructure, keeping it up to date and keeping it in good shape, and also increasing costs and revenue shortfalls. So as time goes by, obviously the cost of managing this infrastructure, of maintaining it is increasing, and also we want to ensure that the takeover of private systems is also a very important challenge that we're facing. There are many sort of very small infrastructure systems across the electoral areas, and sometimes they require greater attention and occasionally even takeover from the government. So the objectives that we find in this particular policy chapter are about responsible infrastructure management through long-range plans that address the growth demands that are aligned with the projected growth of the communities, ensuring that there's operational efficiency and financial and environmental sustainability in our infrastructure systems. So some of the key topics in this policy chapter relate to the various infrastructure systems, notably water, wastewater, stormwater, and drainage. And also we've added a rather large chapter on emergency preparedness as well. So just a few sample policies here. In relation to water, we have improving water quality and supply by mapping and analyzing subareas where water supply might be stressed and applying investments accordingly, and also consulting with jurisdictions that may be dependent on a given water supply before we approve certain developments that could impact that water supply. I think that's especially important in the Coxsila watershed, but also over the Cassidy Aquifer, as we've discussed quite at length over the last few meetings. In terms of wastewater, we want to ensure that individual on-site sewerage systems meet the standards outlined by the BC Sewerage System Practice Manual to prevent ecological degradation. And I think this is particularly the case in a place like Shawnigan Lake, but certainly a very important direction for wastewater. Stormwater, really about developing integrated stormwater management plans, preferably with the help of the province for key watersheds to really ensure that drainage is not polluting our watersheds, and that we can manage the impacts of flooding. And then in terms of emergency preparedness, this is a fairly new section here that we've added, and there's a policy there speaking to designating a network of neighborhood support hubs within the region to really focus and coordinate assistant efforts in the event of an emergency. So this would be a location, a post-disaster location where staff and trained volunteers can prioritize getting information and providing services to the public. Otherwise, there's a few other policies that relate to other topics, such as managing growth with the aim of ensuring at least 75% of new development is connected to infrastructure services, which is tied directly to a very important policy metric. And finally, monitoring solid waste flows and seeking to minimize and diverse waste from landfills, again, as a key component and policy metric here as well. I'll just pass it on to to Mark. Obviously, those are just sample policies. There's a range of other ones as well.
Mr. Chair, I could see you were looking down there. I had my hand up. I wonder if I could ask a question at this stage on the on that particular sample policy.
Yeah, go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I'm looking at this, and as you know, Patrick, protecting the aquifers, especially in my area, has been one of the priorities. I don't see anything apart from on the stormwater there. It says develop integrated stormwater management plans to ensure chemical and biological contaminants do not enter rainwater flows, etc. I don't see anything about the actual monitoring that we may have to do there to protect against this kind of external aggression. Is that something that would be included in any future plans? You know, to say, okay, you're going to build this, but we want this built in for the monitoring as well.
Yeah, I can double check. I know there are aquifer related policies within this policy chapter, so I could double check to make sure that it's in there. But I think what you're speaking to is directly related to monitoring the aquifer and the quality of the water in there. So we'll that's definitely an important piece. If it's not in the policy chapter already, I think it's important that it be there.
Yeah, thank you. It is an important one because if we're going to build stuff on top there, which is obviously going to maybe percolate through, then we need to protect what's underneath it as well. Thank you.
Thank you.
We're at through the chair. So we have area. Obviously, there were many that we've looked at over the last couple of years on this, and obviously we've tried to secure really good metrics on groundwater supplies, and it was really not possible to find regular backups on the key groundwater supplies that would be relevant. There are a lot of issues. There's a lot of work coming, to your point, Councillor Wilson, in this area, and a lot of interest. I believe that down the line, you're going to be able to get much better metric dashboard for this area than what we have right now. But right now we have 2 key metrics in this area. With a general proposed policy target of 75% of the growth is on services, preferably run by the CBRD. Then we monitored we were able to work with the engineering department to get numbers for exactly what percentage of the population is serviced. Currently it's at 16%, and we just provided in the metrics appendix all of the different systems that are out there. Some of them are run privately, some of them are run publicly. You have a policy to continue to take over systems that and get it all under the public umbrella. So this will allow you to track that change over time to see if we can begin to increase the percentage of the population that are on services as the region grows. The last one, again, is solid waste stream statistics. Your engineering group tracks these fairly closely, so we can report accurately and regularly on those. And that's a fairly responsive indicator or metric to any policy changes or program changes that begin to increase diversion from the landfill. Thank you.
Thank you. Questions on those? I see Ian and then Allison. Patrick.
Yeah, through the director to, or through the chairperson to Director Morrison, the idea behind an integrated stormwater management plan would be that it would be done in collaboration, obviously, with the province. It has been done in other regional districts. It's not something completely new, but you're right, most of the drainage infrastructure lies in MOTI's road infrastructure as sort of drainage. Culverts and so it is primarily within the jurisdiction of the province. It's not about taking on that particular role, but it's also about understanding that, drainage issues happen at a watershed scale, and it could be impacted by certain things like development, like hard surfaces, non-porous surfaces. And so it really does require a little bit, which often are dealt with by local governments through development applications and through development permits. And so there are, and of course zoning as well, where we establish certain percentages of lot coverage, right? So there are certain things that we can do as a regional district that could improve drainage. It's really about establishing a more concerted effort, a broader look at drainage issues, because MOTI would often just really be focused on their infrastructure, on the culverts along the right of way of a highway or of a road. And so they aren't getting the bigger picture. And so that concerted effort, I think, would help with certain types of drainage and stormwater management issues that occur in the region. So it is a multi-jurisdictional topic, I suppose.
Okay, thank you. So go to Allison and then Lori.
Thank you. So just off the top, when I look at this chapter, I would say that you need to integrate the emergency. I mean, I know I get that was a move to move that chapter into partly into here, but I don't think you put it in the introduction context very well. It doesn't really pop up until you get into the policies. So that's a bit confusing, I think, for the reader. So that could maybe be addressed. But just to follow up on this last conversation we had, I really think in the policy section that we should, it maybe needs to be emphasized or clarified that what Patrick just explained was absolutely critical on how we manage rainfall and water in general, both for quality and quantity. We have to start taking a whole of watershed perspective, because all the land use that we do has an enormous impact on water. And it's not just a case, I mean, obviously storms and the increasing intensity of storms and flooding and that kind of thing is hugely important. And we need to think about how our land use is impacting our ability to manage what we have on site in these rural areas. But we also have to think about the water quality and the road density and all those things that play into it. So we should be, I think one of the policies should be really about taking a whole of watershed approach, so that you actually look at the broader landscape before you go down into your individual sites. And then what just jumped out at me on the metrics is this one about this first one, which is utility connections. I think what we're trying to do is make sure our places in the urban containment areas are connected. I'm not so sure that we care so much about the rural areas where people are on septic fields and wells. So I think the context should be made in terms of the containment boundaries, or maybe it was, but I don't think so. And then in my area E, there is a large part of area E is connected, or a large part of the developed area is connected to the Duncan water and sewer, and so that should be reflected, because that's not included here. That's all right now. Thank you.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The whole of watershed thinking is really important because the MOTI doesn't look at that. They just look on a piece of paper at the documents, and they are, of course, the subdivision approval. We have a huge issue with that, but we do also at CVRD and in Area D own drainage areas. So we do have a couple of very large drainage areas, but we do need to partner and think of all of the area connected to this, not just the two that we own, because there's too much going on for us to even look at with the pipes and drainage and infrastructure from MOTI that is now cottage cheese. So that is a huge issue that we need to partner, and they do need to look at it in a broader sense. And also with the emergency, I'm very happy to see the emergency piece in here too, especially for my area, which there really isn't. There's just a small little park gazebo where we meet for emergencies. So that is a good thing to have in here. I appreciate it. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. So any further questions on infrastructure? Allison?
Yeah, I would just add that I don't get the solid waste indicator. I don't really understand how I'm supposed to interpret it. So maybe it requires additional description or whatever. And
okay.
Yeah.
You can do that.
Okay, Mark will look into that. All right. Okay, looks like we're ready to move on, Patrick.
All right, thank you. So moving into the next policy chapter, make distinct, complete communities. Some of the challenges that we face across the region are both urban and rural sprawl in terms of just, single detached, low density, often, large subdivisions in areas that aren't well serviced by, local amenities or services, infrastructure. We also have increasing housing costs. Creating a challenge in not just the CVRD, but really across the island and in the lower mainland of BC, and really across the province in many respects. And then finally, out of character development is something that we also want to flag as something of a challenge, because we want to ensure that new development speaks to the unique character of the CVRD, its beautiful landscapes, and of course, the rural character across all the electoral areas. And so our objectives that we've laid out in the MOCP related to this policy chapter speak to planning and design of communities that address resident desires for protecting that unique character of not only villages, but also landscapes, and enhancing affordability, health, well-being, and inclusivity in our communities. So some of the key topics in this policy chapter address housing, community design, arts, culture, and heritage, and parks and recreation as well. So just a few sample policies here in terms of housing, really about managing the supply and demand of housing units with the aim of ensuring that housing price increases don't exceed the rate of inflation, that there's a healthy ratio between housing sales and housing inventory, so that we're building enough housing to essentially supply the influx of folks, of residents in the communities. And that vacancy rates, we try target vacancy rates of rental units above 3%, so that rents don't creep up towards unaffordable levels as well. We also want housing to address the specific needs of diverse individuals, so specifically those that are identified as Indigenous peoples, seniors, youth, people with and low-income families who do struggle to find housing in the community. In terms of community design, there's supporting development that contributes to healthy and happy public spaces suitable for 8 and 80-year-olds. And that's following the spirit of a particular strategy called the 8 to 80 Community Framework. And then we also have a policy here speaking to working with residents and community groups, First Nations and developers to reveal place-based assets and stories as inspiration for building and landscape designs and new projects. So this is really about placemaking. It's about unearthing and creating designs that speak really to the local area, that speak to the history and the heritage of that space. Finally, in terms of parks, recreation, and culture, we find a few sample policies here around encouraging the cultural expression of our residents through public art pieces that reflect diverse community backgrounds, interests, and needs, and exploring funding mechanisms such as CACs, or community amenity contributions, to help create more public art in our communities, and also to expand the recreational trail system to encourage healthy living and appreciation for the outdoors. So again, just a sample of policies. Many of these are specifically related to housing, are trackable and are where we're able to associate performance metrics with, and obviously the length of the recreational trail system is also something that we can track. So I'll just move over now to the performance metrics and hand it over to Mark.
Thanks, Patrick. And through the chair, the metrics in this area are significantly more than the last one. We focus on both housing and on parks as our primary area, as well as some growth, again, trying to focus on within and without or outside the containment boundary. In terms of house prices, the house prices that we were looking at are a number of different indicators. So we can get pretty regular house prices, and there's quite a few sources. The Vancouver Island Real Estate Board is our go-to site for many of these, as they track this and report on it on a monthly basis within fairly reasonable areas that that reflect what the fairly large area of the CBRD, but they're pretty accurate within those areas. They tend to focus more around the Duncan area, so it won't be precisely allocated to all of the different electoral areas, but it gives us a pretty good sense of what's going on. So they track it for ground-oriented multi-townhouses, apartments, and single family. So we can get that data every year. The data clearly shows here what's happened in many other areas, that starting in 2016, prices began to rocket up, and they have, essentially doubled in the last 15 years or less in many areas. So house prices are the first one. House prices as their standalone, item is an interesting one. What matters, I think, from an OCP and the social planning side is affordability. Now, we get fairly regular affordability impacts or information comes in from Vancouver Island Health Authority, does a community survey on a fairly regular basis. We also have the stats can cycles every 5 years. And we can get we do have the affordability levels, which essentially speak to renters and owners spending more than 30% of their gross household income on housing. So the graphs that are in the appendix here look at them from 2006, 2011, and 2016. When this was all compiled, we did not have the 2021 census data available. That is now available, and if the directors wish, we can probably go through and add a new layer of information in this to update it to the most current one, which might be invisible given that this OCP will now move forward over the next 10 to 15 years, and it would be good to start from the base level here. So that's something that can be done if you wish. The growth of different housing type units. We're working on general growth numbers, and a number of these based on some of the projections that Rennie did for you all at the beginning of this work, at the beginning of the MOCP work. And so we're looking there at the different percentages of growth that are being absorbed in different types of housing. So clearly the majority from the graphs in the appendix, the majority of the growth is in single family homes. A much smaller percentage of it is in ground or, basically townhouses and apartments. Or in mobile homes. So we can see the patterns here. The graphs could be expanded significantly to kind of get the sense of it, but you can see the general direction. Now this indicator will move, this metric will move over time. If you begin to move more into multifamily, you'll begin to see these move here within the cycle of an OCP. They should move. Housing starts, obviously, the next two metrics we look at are really a question of supply. growth provides you with the context for demand. These next two give you a sense of supply. What's exciting about these two is that you, as the CVRD, have a lot of control over these, because these essentially are the dialogue between the market and the regulator in how much land is available and how many units are approved and how that's moving. So we can track housing starts. That is regularly tracked by the province within the CVRD. So we can get that consistently on a regular basis for you. So that's with very little time and energy spent on each reporting cycle to do that. They're a couple of years behind here in the latest data we were able to get. It takes them a year or two to get that together, but it begins to give you a bit of a sense of how that's going. What matters primarily for housing prices is the ratio between demand and supply. Now, this can be achieved, this data can be acquired regularly and accurately by simple requests to the Vancouver Island Real Estate Board. They can turn this around for us within the boundaries of the CVRD pretty much exactly, very quickly. So we felt this was an appropriate one that wasn't going to take a lot of time. A balanced market in terms of prices generally sits around 5 to 6 months of inventory. We would call this a 20% ratio between what's available and where the demand is. The graph that you can see in the appendix perfectly matches essentially the beginnings of the rise of the prices, particularly in the last few years, where the demand for homes has greatly exceeded the supply of homes. What that begins to tell you as policymakers is that the market is going to begin to push up housing prices into very dangerous territories for social equity and frankly, just for businesses acquiring staff. We're finding this all over the island and many communities now. So this is an inventory that moves pretty quickly. Your policy responses move a little slower, but it's a really, really key connector between essentially how housing prices and are we keeping up with supply. So those are the key ones for housing. If you could go to the next slide, Patrick, and we'll look at. We have some more in parks. So here we can look at those metrics. So growth statistics, we can track those with census on a regular basis. It's not something you can do a lot about, and nor necessarily would you, but it's a really fundamental metric to track, and we can get those fairly accurately, certainly from census, and occasionally in between the province tracks some of these numbers. Obviously, from a regional planning point of view, and a number of you have raised this to date, particularly including the last one around servicing, the really important discussion on the new urban containment boundaries or growth containment boundaries, and where are we focusing our growth and our servicing investments. So this begins to give you a sense of, is the servicing, are the policies working as you go through each reporting cycle to begin to change the percentage of growth which has been going outside your containment boundaries in the past? At least 50% or more has been outside in at least, sort of minimum 1 hectare lots. Can we begin to narrow that growth and begin to get it into more compact and serviced areas? This will be the metric that tells you whether that's being successful. The last three then are focused on parks and trails. There was a lot of discussion on these metrics, and a lot doesn't even begin to describe it, because you have parks that are owned and managed by many layers of government and even some non-governmental environments, forestry and otherwise. The Parks Department, obviously we need to track metrics that are within the control of the CVRD and generally related to your policies and programs. So the Parks Department suggested that these would be the ones that they're tracking and they can provide response to. They'll also be the most responsive to your changes in investment policy and others around parks and trails. So the parks that are tracked in your OCP and this dashboard are those that are managed, owned and or managed by the CVRD. So total area of parks, the total area per capita per electoral area, and I realize that will probably raise some discussions because some have very large parks in them and others have less, and the recreational trail kilometers that we know of in these areas because they're being added to over time. So that gives you a quick summary of sort of the parks, the housing, and the general growth discussions that we felt we can get accurate, reliable, inexpensive metrics for you on an ongoing basis. Thank you.
Okay, some questions. Okay, I see Lynn and then Mike. I'll just maybe, Ian, okay. I wanted to just put myself in there. Maybe at the beginning, was this a broad one, but population growth assumptions, what are we using for that? It's so important for, the housing is going to limit it severely, I would think. But I think I noticed a 1% annual growth, but are we required to to use a particular assumption by the province, or how does all that work?
Through the chair, this growth number came from Rennie Intelligence and their report that was done for you very early on, and they created a fairly large model that mapped based on population growth statistics from a number of areas that are going into different areas to begin to figure out what's probably coming to you. You're absolutely right, Director Salmon, on housing supply affects that. So long term, if your housing supply went down, then obviously there's less of a chance of that growth arriving. In this metric dashboard, you would then see a corresponding rise in housing prices because the demand would then be exceeding supply. And this becomes the challenge that has driven Patrick and Aaron Licker and Coralie and the whole team in working on trying to find the right growth boundaries that fit into the region with the least environmental impact, make the most sense, and provide you with the capacity that you need to meet what is projected to be incoming. It's a big challenge in policy and planning and growth, because we can't control where people choose to go. All we can do is figure out how best to respond to that, meeting many different trade-offs in public policy.
Okay, thanks. So could you remind us, was Rennie using about a 1% assumption, or what was the population growth?
Patrick, you were going to say something?
Sure. Yeah. So the Rennie model was using the land area within the growth containment boundaries and the land use designations that are available, as well as other metrics. So I don't know the exact percentage, but on page 20 of the MOCP document, section 1.4 growth projections, there are population projections going out to 2025 and 2050 for each of the electoral areas. So across the electoral areas, seeing essentially a population that is today sitting at around 36,000 people up to 46,000. So about 10,500 more residents by 2050 or so.
Okay, thank you. So sorry, I lost track. I have Lynn and then Michael. Who else had their hand up? Ian, Sierra, and Allison. Okay. Go ahead then, Lynn, please.
Thank you. So many of these statistics are interesting, considering we just received our 2021 stats. One of the things I noticed in the 2021 stats for Area G is somehow we've lost 30 homes. So to me, and I checked with the building permits and we had 54. So you kind of think, well, how do we rely on some of these stats that are put out by the Canada Statistics? One of the things that is happening in our areas is we have 3 major projects on the go that you look at the RCMP building, the hospital, and the school being built. And so are we, when you look at those projects and maybe they'll be finished in 2026, are we in a bubble of the pressure for those workers coming to live here while they're working? And so if we continue down the road, when they leave and those projects are done, we may have that gap there that we have more accommodation available or housing available. So I'm not sure that we bring that into this picture. And another one is it's easy to say, we can increase our multifamily housing, but unless there's actually water and wastewater available to connect, then it's not doable. So, they have to go hand in hand when you're looking at all the dwellings and all the housing and all of that. It's like, what's available to connect to make those multi-family homes come forward. And I just can't remember when you talk about the Rennie report. Area G had a bit of an issue with the Rennie report because Area G included the Gulf Islands. So I'm not sure if we ever really figured that one out. I know we had lots of conversations, Coralie and myself, and was a little bit more complex. So I'm not sure if that actually happened. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Patrick.
Just through the chair to Director Smith, I just wanted to note that much of that land use work that we've done in relation to multifamily housing is related to the infrastructure servicing. So what we aspired to do and what we hope we've done is linked any kind of multifamily land use designation to areas that have the capacity or are able to support that type of development. So while the indicators might mention certain things, that's going to be done through the work of the land use plan and the land use map.
Okay, thank you. Mike.
Yeah, thanks, Blaise. Couple of questions there, Patrick. There's a mention there of in art as a CAC instead of cash towards. At the moment, the way it's worked is the CAC is either land or cash in lieu towards, and that cash goes towards the parklands of that particular area. So would this then mean that the cash would go towards art as opposed to the area parks acquisition and maintenance?
Through the chair to Director Wilson, community amenity contributions can, once you develop a community amenity contribution policy or framework, and you may have one already, but you may want to update it to include other types of contributions that these funds can go towards. So it could go towards public art, it could go towards other types of amenities that are desired in the community. It can be a whole range of different types of amenities, so it doesn't need to be limited to one or another. Good,
that makes sense. Yeah, at the moment it's very, very limited as to what we can actually do with it. The second one is I'm going to challenge the figures that you've come up with in section 10, hectares of community parks and all the rest of it in there, because they really are. They don't reflect the true picture, because one of the sentences in there, it says there are several types of parks, regional, provincial, federal, that are not included in the metric, and they vary significantly between electoral areas. They sure do. For instance, I've been running a spreadsheet for the last 2 or 3 years which shows everything within the CVRD, including the munis, and there are this community parks, according to my figures, and they're all traceable, I can let you have copies if you like, can show that the community parks only actually comprise 3% of the total parks that we have, such as regional, municipal, BC provincial parks, federal, national parks, all that stuff. And these figures really don't show the true picture. They only include community parks. Now, if you want a copy of this Excel spreadsheet, more than welcome to it. It shows, and all the sources are there as well. I don't like these figures. They don't reflect the true picture of what we've actually got within our areas. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mike. And it looks like they would indeed maybe send it to everyone.
Yeah, I have sent it to everybody before, but you can have it again, that's for sure.
Ian, can you hear me? Ian, I don't think you can hear me.
He's gone dead.
Yeah. Mark?
Thank you, through the chair. Excellent point, and a really critical metric that is weaponized in many discussions in many regions all the time on this one. We'll go back in. I'll take your direction. Really appreciate that. We'll go back in and talk to the planning department and the GIS team and see what we can track around that. This would be particularly interested within the growth containment boundary versus outside the growth containment boundary and within a certain distance of servicing that might be servicing. We'll take a look at that. One of the concerns we had working through this was the amount of time it takes to pull the data from the systems. There was a lot of anxiety about developing a dashboard that would then take months and months every update and a lot of money to pull all that new data. This seems to me to be one that we probably do have reasonable data on areas that have been approved that carry a certain amount of, that carry certain criteria this way. So thank you for the direction. We will definitely look at that, see if we can find it.
Great, thank you. We are at 11:03. How are people doing? Do you want to break now or carry on? Looks fine for another 5 or 10. Okay, Sierra?
Thanks. I'll prep everyone for a break. Speaking of anxiety, or heard the word anxiety, I have a lot of anxiety when it comes to the growth topic here that's being discussed. And I know that we met and we talked about the containment boundary in Shawnigan Lake and expanding it, and there was all kinds of suggestions on expanding it. And I also noticed on page 38 a mention about, what was it, the exact wording? Anyway, it was about community approval on that. So there has actually been no community approval. That was simply us discussing it. Sorry, my son's trying to get me. And then the topic of, so what I'm really fearful of is having an OCP like we do now. We operate with an OCP that was written 20 years ago, and we assumed by now we would have a sewer system, and we don't. And so, there's a lot of growth happening, but without the services. And so where's the wording for that? Like, we can always change it once we do have a sewer system, but I really worry about designing it so that in mind that we're going to have a sewer system, and we don't.
Okay. Mark? Anyone have a comment, Mark?
Through the chair, it's an excellent question, especially around the lake. The lake is a unique conundrum in growth management, and our team has spent many hours wrestling with this, as you know, trying to determine what's in the interest of the lake and the need to extend servicing to begin to close septic systems. There's some debate as to whether those septic systems ultimately are damaging the lake. I think your point about the demand for growth, second cottages being torn down and full-time homes being put into place. The question around the lake draw and the deposition of sewer is a really big issue. Completely, the conundrum that occurred in the discussion without a simple answer was, do we permit more growth in order to pay for the sewer and water systems, since it's very difficult to get significant grants from the province or the feds to put in water and sewer systems in order to decouple the growth from the lake? So we're not pulling as much water from the lake, at least on a regular basis, and not potentially risking the deposition of or having sanitary problems going into the lake. In order to pay for that, do we use growth? Is it public investment? What areas have enough density of growth to support those systems versus those that are a lower density, which it probably wouldn't be feasible and may not actually be as much of an environmental concern? So it's a really important issue, and to your point, I think the community needs to have a robust discussion on this, because it's not a simple answer. There are trade-offs with every option. I would defer to Patrick as well for he's been a key architect of these trade-offs all the way through, a very, very thoughtful approach.
So I think, just going off of Mark's comments here is the approach that we landed, having an urban containment boundary boundary that extends all the way around the lake, because we don't want to signal that we want growth to occur all around the lake. But we understand that there is those trade-offs, primarily around, do we want to allow growth to pay for some of that sewer, those sewer infrastructure upgrades? And so what we've done is, rather than extend that growth containment boundary all the way around, we've indicated that those properties adjacent to the lake or close to the lake are within a special study area that will require studying, the cost of infrastructure, whether it's upgrades of on-site sewage systems, or if it is about, perhaps adding a bit more allowances for growth around the lake, so that it can be paid for by the private sector as opposed to public investment. So there's all sorts of ways to move forward with this, but what we're suggesting is that we essentially label those properties around the southern and sort of western edge of the lake as a special study area to undergo an infrastructure servicing study that looks at all the various options and financing mechanisms that could be available to help the lake.
Okay, so a follow-up?
Well, I think the liquid waste management plan is looking at those type of things, but it's not particularly just the lake part. It's really the village, the areas all around the village, that kind of growth that just keeps happening with multi-systems around the lake. Like we've discussed, is often cabins are only there a couple months of the year. It's when it's dry, and it's not as a large an issue as we have thousands of people living in the village and growing there. And then what we discussed was almost doubling that containment boundary, pushing it out, towards Mill Bay and away from the Legion in that area, and allowing the higher density. So I would like to understand how the wording works so that we're not doing what I get. I guess it was not my understanding to try and increase the growth so that we could get the sewer system. What I would like to see is we don't increase the growth until we have the sewer system, because it's creating a lot of issues, and it's just furthering the urban sprawl, as you've mentioned, and we're developing into a community that I don't think we wanted to see. So how do we ensure that the sewer system comes before the growth?
Okay.
So perhaps I might be able to answer a little bit of that through the chair to Director Acton. One of the things that we tried to do with the land use plan is essentially mimic the land uses that were developed through the village charrette, the Shawnigan Lake Village charrette. So much of that has been put in place, but I think you might be referring to kind of the surroundings of the village, the increase in land that's being made available for potential development. We can certainly look at perhaps, tailoring or bringing in the growth containment boundary a little bit if that's something that is of a major concern. I think we want to make sure that those liquid waste management that new liquid waste management infrastructure and plan can also impact or support that future growth. And so that's why we created that corridor from Mill Bay to Shawnigan Lake, to really align that infrastructure system with potential areas for new housing units. So there is a little bit of a balancing act here, but I certainly appreciate the comments, and there are certain things like latecomer fees where the infrastructure system is put in first, and then as development occurs, it pays into the system. But that is obviously a little bit more of a risky sort of way of dealing. If the development doesn't come, then that certainly puts extra pressure on the paying and the costs of that infrastructure system. Mark.
Thank you. through the chair, the control of the land use, Director Acton, we have a toolkit that we can use, and maybe what we're hearing from you is an advocacy to take this toolkit and use it strategically for the powers that it gives the board in how it controls land. So the growth containment boundary has generally in this discussion been established as a boundary beyond which we would not plan to invest in servicing unless we had a problem that needed some direct attention and there was money to do it. Otherwise, we would generally have that as rural, and what's inside the growth containment boundary would be pending the other controls we have over land use would be more the attention to that. One way we could use these tools to address your concern is if a policy is established in the official community plan to say exactly what you gave voice to in your concern, is that densities in this area, growth in this area of any measurable density should not be approved without the infrastructure to support it. Then you have zoning that can establish certain densities or minimum densities, usually we can use that tool to do this. Your biggest one will be your land designation we're talking about here that begin to speak to that area. This will mostly be in your local area plan, which is the process that's coming up specifically targeted to each of your electoral areas. But in those, you can establish those policies. So the growth containment boundary is one tool, and it's really just a line, a unidimensional line. The more complex discussion about where we would allow types of servicing falls under land designations, your infrastructure plan, and zoning. You have full control over all of those as a board. You can rezone land, you can change designations. We might want to use the tools of land designation, zoning, and those to get at, to allay your concerns and begin to control that clearly shows that growth should not happen unless it's serviced, so that it puts the onus on developers, on landowners working with the regional district to work on that servicing if they do want to put the growth in and make sure that that happens. So I think we can use tools besides the growth containment boundary to achieve your goals.
Excuse me, Mr. Chair, may I suggest that Mr. Holland turns off his video, and that might be helpful for his bandwidth, because he was cutting out a little bit, but I got the message myself.
Okay, yeah. Good point. Okay, well, that's good.
Can I just follow up one more time?
Okay. Well,
just what Patrick said about thanks, Mark, that was a good explanation. And that would be good to go that route. But what Patrick had said about the Think Shawnigan, maybe I just misunderstood, but in the Think Shawnigan plan, further development is also dependent on, like that development area is also dependent on a sewer, like, so, you know, the suggested laneway houses and that kind of thing. So, yeah, thanks.
Good to know. Thanks.
Okay, well, very important discussion. It's 11:15. Why don't we take a 10-minute break? I still have Allison when we come back, and then we'll try to wrap up the whole thing around 12:15 or so. Because see you at 11:25.
Yeah, Blaze, I just sent that thingy out to Patrick and Mark and everybody else there. They've got should have those that workbook now.
Oh, great. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, thank you. Welcome back. I think I have Allison next on my list.
Thank you, Blaze. So I am thinking about this make distinct complete communities, and I think it would be helpful to provide more specificity about what we mean about distinct complete communities. And I think from our conversation, probably what we're focusing on here are the areas that we've put growth containment boundaries around. And I think it would be probably helpful to have targets for, or a better description of what we mean by a growth containment area. So I am assuming, because we are generally an rural electoral areas, that we're not talking about having urban style growth in a growth containment boundary. But we seem to be moving into the direction of villages. So it's like we should explain these growth containment areas and what the targets would be, and then set some metrics around what for that type of density, what is an appropriate servicing as far as amount of parks. And the other thing that I think we're missing completely is this notion of connectivity. And so people have talked a lot in my area about the need to be able to get places safely. And I don't think metrics around trails within a park are helpful for people to connect to other, to move around, apart from when they're in the park, enjoying the park. So that's sort of what I'm thinking about off the top of my head on this one.
Okay, thank you. Any comments on that, Patrick or Mark?
If I may, just through the chair to Director Nicholson, I think one of the things that we certainly can do is speak a little bit to the role that growth containment boundaries have in terms of promoting and encouraging complete and distinct communities. I think a model of rural planning that is really important, and one that we strive to achieve in many sort of rural areas throughout the province is having smaller villages that are distinct from the agricultural and natural lands. And so the growth containment boundary is one tool of many that can really promote that sort of village establishment and ensuring that services, amenities, and other aspects that make living in a village a very pleasant and high quality of life is established within those growth containment boundaries. So we can certainly add some language in relation to that, in relation to indicators that speak to connectivity and mobility throughout the region. I think we're about to get into the enhancing mobility options policy chapter, and I think there's probably a few indicators in there that speak a little bit to that.
If I may share, just as a response as well, can you hear me okay? Is this okay with my camera on? Okay.
Yeah.
We actively looked at the question of trails and proximity of growth to village services and connections of trails from residential population areas to schools, and those. We dug on that one quite a bit over the last 2 years trying to find data. The conclusion was that the data that we would be able to get would require a very, very significant amount of GIS time to track changes or the very existence of it over time. The second observation was that trails that would connect these would end up, they're either in public land or private land or some hybrid of those, and often hard to track because of it. This then moves the conversation to where Patrick has now pointed us to, which is our next discussion on transportation and mobility, in that we would then be talking about essentially pedestrian infrastructure or cycling infrastructure, but let's say pedestrian infrastructure within the MOTI corridors that govern most of all of your mobility in the region. And that based on MOTI's agendas, finances, maintenance issues, that it would be very challenging to set up a metric to track that when they generally are not interested. They don't have the budgets to build or maintain a lot of sidewalks and other things in these areas. And by the time we worked through the swamp of all these different components, it was generally felt that this could be more confusing rather than shedding light. That being said, I think the metric or the target, the agenda that the director is speaking to is an excellent one. We've just really been unable to come up with a simple metric that we felt we could trust would give you the right feedback to date. But it by no means reduces the importance of it. Thank you.
Follow up, Allison?
Thank you. Yes, I get that this is all very challenging. One area that we might be able to get a little bit more, make a little bit more progress quicker because we have more control over that would be our parks. And it seems to me that we have different kinds of parks, and that we could easily establish targets for access to playgrounds within a containment boundary. When there's a certain amount of population, you should have access to a kid's playground sort of thing. or access to a park that you can go for a walk or recreate or whatever. So I just think that we need to start moving in that direction a little bit, because when I look at the stats on the parks, it seems completely variable from area to area and not connected perhaps to where the density of the people that where the densest places where people live are.
Okay, thank you. So I have Klaus and then Lynn. Klaus?
Yeah, the outlying areas are a bit of a challenge when it comes to trying to service them, and that applies to public transportation as well as let's say connectivity with trails or whatever. There seems to be a trend, like people like to move into outlying areas, and once they've moved there, they try to well, I guess what you call gentrify the area, because they come from a city, and their dream is, well, let's live in a smaller town or whatever. And then they come with their demands as to, well, no, we want this, we want this, we want sidewalks, we want lanterns, we want this. And often it doesn't fit. First of all, the money isn't there because it just doesn't justify it. It's stretched too far. And I think what should be pointed out in a way is to these people is, look, if you move into an area like that, you're going to have to adjust to what's applicable there, what is possible. We cannot adjust to you, and I think that has to be kind of made clear. Eventually, an area will grow, and then services will come in and public transportation. But if you're far out of a town and you expect the same services that a congested area has, it's a dream. You can't achieve it. And I think somehow that has to be pointed out.
Thank you. I'll go to
I think you indicated me. I didn't quite hear. One of the things that I think really holds us back when it comes to parkland is the Local Government Act with the 5% parkland dedication. 5% is nothing when it comes to development, and to provide an amenity for the community and for the development, having a trail in that community, that in that development, helps connect them with other parts of the community. And so sometimes I think that some of the Local Government Act actually takes away from our ability to look at doing something like that. And the 5% cash in lieu, it could maybe buy a rock in a corner these days. So, those are areas that we're struggling with to add to connectivity, to add to parks. And so I don't know how we get that into the wording here to try and increase the amenities that come with some of the land use development, so that there is that connectivity or there is that park.
Thank you. Any comments there? Just take those.
Yeah, if I may, through the director or through the chair to Director Smith, I do believe that the 5% that's indicated in the Local Government Act is a minimum. I think if a local government wishes to ask for more, it is also possible. Is that correct?
If I may, through the chair, the local governments can ask for up to 5% through the subdivision process. Through the regular approval process of a rezoning, they can ask for anything that they want, whatever your policies are. So I think Director Smith's observations can certainly be absorbed into the policies, both in terms of size, but also the 5% when a developer does a subdivision, they'll typically, to your point, Director Smith, take the the least desirable chunk of rock over in the corner and call that the new public park. I think there's definitely a case to be made for a policy that speaks to that 5% being integrated into a trail connectivity network where that would benefit the community for sure. That's definitely something you can include in your policies.
Okay, I see Anne popped up as well.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, I just wanted to reiterate that the local government can negotiate for additional parkland beyond the 5% in the context of a rezoning application. So if the zoning is in place, allows the subdivision of land based on the zoning, then 5% is your maximum. Going beyond that is only possible during the context of a rezoning in which there's a negotiation. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. So I have Lori and Sierra. Did I miss Ben? Okay. Anyone else? Okay, Lori, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. In Cowichan Bay itself, we've been working on for years connective trails, beach access, and all of that. We've done a fairly good job. We need to do more connecting the upper village to the lower village, which we're working on as well. But the one thing that I've noticed, it kind of goes back into equity, is our expectations of when people move in that Director Kuhn was speaking to is, I have people that don't understand the dark skies. And if you've moved here from Ontario, and he was, this certain person was completely frightened about the dark, and we could have immigrants from other war-torn countries. We're talking about equity from other countries and stuff like that. So I don't know how we're going to explain that, but the expectations they're looking for is the street lights and all of that, which is not going to be available out here. And I would hope that more people would, for climate and all of that, would move into that, so we could see our oceans, we can see our stars. But then we have to be able to explain that in a very clear way. So I'm challenged with that one. And also the garbage pickup, the cost of it's off the trail part, but the garbage, and you have to go way up to, I always call it no man's land, to pick up. Those are costs in all of that too, and the expectations of having all those services like they did in the city. So there needs to be explanations of that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for those points. Sierra.
Yeah, Lori brought up some good points, or interesting points on expectations and the costs of living out in rural areas. But I would caution some of the comments around, new people coming to the community. And I think, I remember Ross Blackwell would say, you have a hole in your bucket and you start to not notice that there's a hole in your bucket. So it does happen sometimes when people move to the community, and specifically like in Shawnigan Lake, the 3 top things they'll notice is our roads are horrible. There's dead cars everywhere, and there's shipping containers everywhere, and there's lots of litter. So, I don't think those are bad things that we should look at and try and improve the aesthetics or the S word, sidewalks. So I don't know. I would be cautious, because once somebody, people are part of the community, it doesn't matter how long they've been there. It doesn't make you a better community member than someone else. So, anyway, it causes, there's some friction there. I get it, but I just, people are going to move here and want to improve things, and I hope that they do.
Thank you. Ben?
Oh, okay, thanks. Sorry, you cut out there.
Sorry.
So just under Parks and Recreation, I'm just trying to understand some of the policies that are written there, because they don't necessarily align with some of the things that are happening up in Area H. And one of them is around cluster parking, cluster parks, DC 35, and then discouraging small, isolated, single-purpose parks. What I have feedback in our community is that people want to be able to walk to parks. And so, it's about having, parks spread out, so that they can, don't have to, you can go on a bicycle, don't have to necessarily drive. And so I'm not sure how those things are applicable, and whether those are important to be in an OCP.
Patrick?
Through the chair to Director Martman, I think, the policy to discourage small, isolated, single-purpose parks is really a reflection of the occasional sort of park that really only caters to one particular user group and isn't really usable most of the time, or it's too small that it doesn't actually provide much use for local residents. So typically we do try to, encourage the clustering of parks and open space. This is perhaps actually a bit of a response to Director Smith's comments around, wanting to make sure that any kind of new park has some form of connection to the park system, or has some form of is big enough to be used by folks. But I certainly understand that we want a diversity of scales of parks. So we want some parks that might be more neighborhood focused. It might just be a children's playground, for example, and that might make sense as a small park next to a residential subdivision. To the needs of just a broader population. I don't think we would say no to playgrounds because of that policy, but it's certainly something we could word perhaps a little bit more descriptively to ensure that, we would be supportive of smaller parks that cater to very local needs, for instance.
Okay, follow up, Ben?
Thanks. And I appreciate that, because I think one of the things that I'm really coming from a very rural perspective. We have no particular nodes in a lot of our area. And so, these little, what could be considered from a village or an urban area, they say, wow, that's very isolated. And yet for us, it's like, oh, that's a perfect place for it. Access to something. And it might be just the users of that neighborhood. So thanks for that.
Good. Okay. So seeing no further questions on this section, shall we move to the next section, Patrick?
Sure.
Okay.
All right. So moving into the next section on expanding mobility options. So again, some of the challenges that we face in terms of transportation is related to obviously the vast geography that is the CVRD and the relatively low population density that makes it a challenge to connect people to other people and to destinations. There's a lack of authority in terms of having to work obviously with the Ministry of Transportation and Infrastructure in the province to address some of these transportation challenges. The unintegrated land use and transportation system. So really a focus of good planning is to ensure that land uses and transportation systems are well integrated, so that you have some of the higher densities next to some of your public transit and active transportation systems. So that's a bit of a challenge today, and gaps obviously in not only the trails network but other transportation system networks, whether they be cycle lanes or whether it's even just the bus system missing in certain places, or missing certain types of community nodes. So the objectives of this particular chapter are to encourage the development of infrastructure for more sustainable modes of transportation and reducing car dependency, essentially so that we can ensure that the region is really well connected and people can get to their destinations in an effective manner. So the key topics in this chapter relate to sustainable modes of transportation and obviously the vehicle or car modes. So a sample of policies here. In terms of sustainable modes, we speak obviously to active transportation and supporting initiatives that increase those sustainable transportation modes like transit, cycling, and walking. We speak also to supporting BC Transit in its initiatives and working in collaboration with them to make the transit system a bit more user-friendly. Specific actions related to that relate to updating the Transit Future Action Plan, establishing a new interregional transit route with the regional district of Nanaimo that doesn't exist today, installing bus shelters in as many locations as possible to improve that user experience if it's inclement weather. Incorporating real-time and automatic bus locators, installing automated passenger counters, obviously expanding handy darts and regular service, especially for those who might have special needs or different abilities, and finding suitable locations for expanded park and ride facilities along those key bus routes, including safe bike lockers so that folks can travel throughout the region in a multimodal fashion. And then finally, for vehicle modes, really important to support the use of electric vehicles and encourage the installation of EV charging stations as a key component of our climate crisis mitigation and reducing GHGs from automobiles and transportation. And ensuring adequate parking areas adjacent to major destinations like parks, trails, and beaches so that folks aren't parking in residential. The visual impacts of that parking on the landscape. So this is, again, just a sample of different policies in that policy chapter. I'll just move it on to Mark for a couple metrics here.
Thank you, Patrick. We just have a couple of metrics in this section. Obviously, there is a lot of different data we can look at, and we looked at many different pieces and settled on just two. The mode of transportation to work is the primary transportation indicator or metric that is used in most communities. So we can get accurate data from census as well as from the BHAW community surveys that come through. So what you see in the appendix here is that ratio. Obviously, if for any of you who have that graph open, you can see that in order to begin to move the bar on that significantly, we need to be getting into densities like Duncan if we want to start really moving up the walkable area, because in a rural area we're quite a ways away from most of the things we would do. In which case, transit, cycling infrastructure, things like that support that. If we move to the second one, then is essentially because in a rural area, if we're not going to drive, then really the primary other choice is going to be transit. Now, transit has a general policy in our research into this to provide a transportation mode for people in the broadest area rather than focusing on putting a transit line between super high population areas in a direct line in order to get the ridership up. So it's a strategic, I think maybe an equity agenda that they have there. Fortunately, about 50% of your area right now is within about a half a kilometer of a transit line. Now, these don't run very frequently, so they are really, a secondary choice in many cases. I think the discussion moves forward through this OCP into subsequent decades as all vehicles increasingly become zero emission vehicles. The conversation around this modal share, et cetera, and climate change and other things will begin to shift a little bit. These were two we felt we could get reliable data from without extensive studies and things every few years done to keep track of this, and that would provide you some decent feedback on policy success or policies you may want to choose to pursue. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Okay, now we go to questions. So I have Lynn and Ben. Go ahead, please, Lynn.
Thank you. One of the things that I don't quite see in here is BC Transit is definitely a huge investment for some communities, and they may not work the best. And I'm just not seeing anything encouraging entrepreneurs or other options out there for transit or mobility options. If BC Transit's the only option, then it doesn't really say, it says expand mobility options, but if you only have one option for the transit, then you're not really expanding your mobility options in that regard. So we should be looking at other ways to come up with a solution. So I just don't see that in there, and maybe someone could speak to that. Thank you.
So through the chair to Director Smith, are we talking about perhaps encouraging private transportation systems to help and support the movement of people to destinations?
Yes, I think that that's definitely a direction we need to go if there's that option for people. Thank you.
Yeah, we can take a look at that.
Okay. All right. Okay. Thank you, Lynn. We'll go to Ben now.
Thanks. And I liked what you had to say about the percentage of the metric around percentage of population within 400 meters. But when you look at that metric, I think what you're missing there is what you said about, yes, you may have access, but you only get it once a day. So is there a way to frame it so that you also can say, yes, you may have access, but it's services will have to expand to make it viable for you. I'm not sure how to word it, but anyways. And then the second thing I had was, where did that picture come from of the 2-lane bike path? Sorry, it's it's wonderful, but I'm not sure where that is.
Yeah, that's through the chair to Director Martman. That's a stock image that we include in our in our presentations and plans from time to time. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I think any picture you see in here, I expect it would be of the area. Sorry, not stock. So, so anyways, thanks.
If possible.
Maybe just as, I think, it is a common request. And one of the things that we like to perhaps sometimes also, I guess, communicate is that these documents are intended to be vision oriented and inspiring. So it's not to say that there aren't photos of that nature that we could use within the CVRD, but sometimes we do find the use of certain images really gets the point across real well. So I hear your comment, and we'll see if we can find an image that's just as communicative of that particular illustration. So
good. Thank you. Any further questions on mobility options? Go ahead, Allison.
Well, I just was going to raise the point that Ben made about the percentage of population within 400 meters of a transit line, because I think, if I recall, Mr. Wakeham has often talks about some particular, I can't remember what he calls it, some particular target that he has for having a complete, more complete transit service. And he used it when they were trying to fix the service through Eagle Heights area. So I suspect that they could provide that, because it is quite different than having the bus go by once or twice a day. And I think it would be more relevant if we could see that kind of an improvement.
Okay, thank you. Lynn.
I'd just like to have a quick conversation about page 82, MO 24. It says review vehicle parking requirements in the zoning bylaw to avoid an oversupply of vehicle parking for new developments, including industrial areas well connected to transit. So then what you're going to find is you're going to find that you're going to have everybody parking in front of other businesses or on the road or that. Do you see that happening? Just because you have transit going that is available may not connect to the people that are driving to those businesses or that development. So parking could become a real issue for those in the adjacent areas. Thank you.
So through the chair to Director Smith, so I think the policy is quite clear to avoid an oversupply of parking. And this is a common sort of challenge that many communities face, is oftentimes developments, especially developments that were built and zoning bylaws that were created back in the 70s or 60s, often provided parking requirements that supplied an oversupply of parking, where a lot of parking stalls are essentially not used, are vacant, and what that does is it increases the impervious surfaces of the lot. It also increases the cost of housing significantly for certain types of developments, because it is quite expensive to provide parking infrastructure, especially if we have other requirements like wanting to put some of that parking in multifamily developments underground. But the idea here is just to really make sure that we're right-sizing the parking requirements to the development. Typically people who live in rental buildings, people who live close to transit lines do tend to have fewer cars than others. And it is about right-sizing that so that we're not covering the entire lot in parking. So really, we're just trying to avoid an oversupply of parking. We're not trying to reduce the parking to a point where then people are parking their cars everywhere else.
Okay, thank you. Further questions on this section? No? Okay, so I'm looking at the time. It is now noon. I'm thinking what we should probably do is break for lunch, since we have another meeting, and we will obviously have to come back next week on the 10th. So, Ms. Harrison, how should we structure that? Okay, that was moved.
Oh, no. I just wanted to.
Okay. You had a question?
Mr. Chair, I just thought that if we could go till 12:30, it would be helpful. For less time on Thursday. But you want to finish with a chapter, like with a.
Yeah, well, I just don't have a consensus. What people want to break now, or try to do one more?
I'd like to break now.
All right, that was at least 2 break now. So, and I do see Coralie has her hand up too.
Yes, thank you through the chair. There is a staff report which could be considered today or next week, and it was responding to the director's request for a quote on in-person to replace the virtual final sessions of local area plans at the end of May. Thank you.
Okay, so that was item R2 then on the agenda. Is there any, Coralie, is that any urgency with doing that?
Through the chair, next week is fine, but the sooner the better, because we do have ad placements going out, and the schedule and the type of meeting will need to be adjusted at least by next week anyway. Thank you.
Okay, well, it sounds like maybe we should try to do that one now if it's not too long. Do you think? What do people think? Sierra?
Well, I would like to give some feedback on that. So I guess if Coralie would like to have information sooner than later, perhaps we could maybe even just do a round, like everybody get to speak once on it or something.
Yeah, I don't believe we should rush this at all.
Yeah, I'm getting kind of tired. I'm aware we've got a big meeting later, so I'd rather leave that if it's not going to, if we can, till next week. So, okay, Coralie's fine with that. Okay, Lori?
I just thought, can't we vote on that? Because it seems very simple. Do we want to have it'll be in person or not, and the advertisement? I don't think that it is a huge conversation, is it? It's very challenging.
Well, I think Ben wanted to speak, and Sierra wants to speak. It could take a little while.
Oh, okay.
Okay. All right. So if Okay, that was moved. We have a seconder for that? All in favor? Opposed? Motion carries. Okay, so we're done. Thank you, everyone. Thank you.